Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Last time we left off at the end of chapter 10 in 1 Samuel / 1 Kingdoms, depending on your naming, Stephen. Then, of course, we took a break last week for our nation's holiest day, Super Bowl Sunday. So I'm going to start with some recap of what we talked about last time. Before that, though, I wanted to make a comment because I made some more extended comments about this when we started 1 Samuel / 1 Kingdoms. About how now at this point we're really getting into the time where we have lots of archaeological evidence and that kind of thing. But I hope even before this, as we've been going on and I've been talking about these things, you've noticed that, the Philistines in the Bible, or the Amorites in the Bible, or these places in the Bible we're talking about, these events that are being described, these are events that happened in the real world. These are events that happened in the real world. Maybe look at me and say, duh. But speaking religiously, this is an important distinction between Christianity and Judaism, to be fair, and most other religions in the world. Okay? I mean, we read mythology, and I've talked about mythology. I've talked about some of the myths and some of the gods and goddesses. Well, all these events that take place with these gods and goddesses getting together and having their children and having their brothers and sisters. Yeah, none of those happen in anything that looks like our real world. Right? They're all in sort of this mythological world. Okay? These are so the fact that all these events that God is working in our world is important. It's important because Christianity isn't a religion like Buddhism. Buddhism, it doesn't matter if Siddhartha, the original Buddha, if he never lived, if he never existed, it really doesn't matter for Buddhism. Because Buddhism is teaching a path to enlightenment. So regardless of who the first person to follow their path to enlightenment was, that doesn't really matter because their religion is about this path to enlightenment. Okay? Our religion isn't about some method of salvation, and it's not about some kind of mythological process. Our religion is based in the story of what God has done with us and in our world, starting with creating it at the beginning of Genesis, and then how he has related to and interacted with and saved human beings ever since, and then most importantly, of course, how he himself became a human being in the person of Jesus Christ. Unlike Buddhism, if Jesus Christ never existed, then we might as well all pack it up and go home right now. Okay, if there was no human being, Jesus Christ, and he wasn't God, and he didn't die, and he didn't rise again, we're all wasting our time here. Okay? We are completely wasting our time. And we might as well all go home. Because our religion is grounded in the fact that these things really happened in our real world. And that's why they're meaningful to us. But this also, when we're having discussions with people who are of other religions and other faiths, this is an important thing that separates our faith from theirs in a lot of cases. Okay? Even a lot of other forms of Christianity have sort of lost track of their historical basis. There are a lot of forms of other Christianity where if you come to them and ask them what their faith is all about, they'll talk about how they had an experience, and got saved. And it sounds more like Buddhism, right? It sounds more like, well, if you pray this prayer and then do this and then do this and do this, you'll be saved. Right? And it's not about what Jesus did and who he is. It's about something that happened in their life where they experienced salvation. Or to take another example, if you're talking to someone from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, okay, that's another religion that makes historical claims. They have the Book of Mormon that talks about how a group of Jews sailed to what's now the United States of America, and how all these Native American tribes are descended from those Jewish tribes. Difference between that teaching and Christianity is archaeology and genetics has completely disproven that story. It's simply not true. None of those people groups they talk about existed. Philistines, no ancient historian you run into is going to argue with you the Philistines didn't exist. That they didn't conquer these areas at this time, that these battles didn't happen. Okay. So there's historicity here. There's historicity here. There are certain things, obviously, that we can't historically prove. We can't historically prove that Jesus rose from the dead. Right? We have pretty good historical evidence that he lived and died, but we can't prove that he rose from the dead. That's something that we believe. But it's a belief about something that we say historically happened. We say that actually happened on the third day after he was crucified. To be real specific, March 25th in 32 AD. We say something happened on that day. That's why in the Nicene Creed it's so important that we say that Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate. He's the only guy who gets mentioned there. He's a Roman governor. Okay? We've got inscriptions with his name on them. You can go and see the Roman records all agree he was the governor of Judea at that time. We're saying these things happened, and they happened at this point in time. Okay. So we're not just believing in made-up stories that someone made up at some point in history, and we find those stories charming and meaningful or heartwarming or whatever. And we're not just believing in somebody's system. Here's how to live a successful life. Here's how to experience enlightenment. Okay? We've seen, as a church, we've seen what God has done for us in Jesus Christ, and we believe in what He's done, and we put our trust in it, in those actual things that actually happened in this world that we live in. Does that make sense? I wanted to emphasize it. And as we go through, and I'll continue to note that as we go through on these things, like there's already going to be a couple things I'm going to note tonight, I know, when we get to them. The reason I'm noting those things from history or archaeology or whatever is to say, just to remind us, this isn't just an interesting story, that might teach us a moral lesson. We're reading about actual people who lived and died and how they related to the same God that we worship today. Okay. So now I'll move on to a little summary of last week. For folks who weren't, or for 2 weeks ago, I'm not going to summarize the football game. Summary of 2 weeks ago, get us kind of caught up to where we are now. We saw how the Israelites got into trouble again. They were rather in a sorry state. The Philistines came and were oppressing them. They went into battle against the Philistines and lost. And so the Israelites' theory was, well, if we're going to go back into battle, we need something to make sure we'll win. I know, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant with us, then we'll have to win. Okay? So they basically decided to treat the Ark of the Covenant like an idol. The Philistines understood it basically the same way, because when the Ark of the Covenant showed up, the Philistines said, look, they brought one of their gods. Unfortunately for the Israelites, God doesn't work that way with idols, and so they ended up not only losing the battle, they ended up losing the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant back to one of their cities. To make a long story short, people started getting horrible tumors. So the Philistines started moving it like a hot potato from city to city. Everywhere they took it, there was this plague. So finally they said, you know what, let's just send it back. So they put it on an ox cart and sent it back. Sent it back towards the Israelites. Okay? So the Philistines saw the Philistines learned through this with the Ark of the Covenant, they learned something of the fear of Yahweh, this God of the Israelites, right? They saw his power. They made comparisons. The Philistines said, this is like what happened in Egypt to Pharaoh. You know, we shouldn't mess with this God either. But when the Israelites got the Ark back, their response wasn't to repent and cry out to God to free them from the Philistines, but rather they said, you know what we really need if we're going to win this war? We need a king like all those other countries have to lead us into battle. Because if we had a king, then we'd win. Okay. Now Samuel, the prophet, who had sort of been functioning like one of the judges we've been reading about, God comes to him and says, basically, don't take this personal. Right? They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. Because what they were really doing was they were rejecting the idea of God ruling over them directly. They wanted a human being to rule over them. And more importantly, God's whole purpose for them, as we saw in Deuteronomy, was that they would be special, that they would be different from all the other nations. And so that by watching them, all the other nations would be changed to become more like them. Well, Israel's doing the exact opposite. Israel's saying, nah, forget about that God. We want to be just like all the rest of these guys. They seem to have it together.
At this point in time, I mean, maybe I'm not the sharpest pencil in the box, but these people haven't figured it out yet. And they're now asking for a king after they've seen what the kings do. I don't understand their thinking. Because God's done showed them what he can do. And if you do like he does, you're going to be a whole lot better off than these people. So why would you want to be like them in the first place after he's give you all this? And is willing to give you even more?
Well, part of it...
mindset, or is it just the people are not... we look at it, we know what it means today.
Right.
Because we've had 2,000 years of people reading the book and digesting and saying, this, and this happened.
And of having kings.
Yeah, and of having kings. We're still in the same mess they are. I mean, we elect them now.
Yeah. Well,
I can't...
Part of it is, and part of what's going on here, and it's been alluded to a little bit. Remember at the end of Deuteronomy, God kept saying, don't go to, remember he kept telling, don't go to sorcerers, don't go to diviners, I'm going to send you a prophet, and he'll say my words, he'll interpret this stuff to you, he'll tell you this. Part of what's attractive about the religions of these other nations, right, is that Yahweh, God, is telling the Israelites, he's basically making promises to them and asking them to just believe that those promises are true. Okay. The other religions, say Baal worship, okay, are based on them going out and doing rituals and performing what we would call magic acts and rituals that then make Baal do what they want. So if they want rain for their crops, okay, Yahweh says, just follow me, do what you're supposed to do, and trust me, I'll send you the rain for your crops. Okay. The priests of Baal say, well, come here and sleep with our temple prostitutes. Sleep with our temple prostitutes, participate in this ritual and this ritual and this ritual, offer these animals to Baal, and you'll get the rain for your crops. Okay? So, in their minds, and this isn't so foreign to us. This isn't so foreign to us. We today have a lot of trouble trusting God to provide for us too. Remember, I mean, that's the dilemma Abraham was facing back in Genesis. Right? God says you're going to have a son, and he says, well, my wife's too old. Well, I got a slave woman who seems fertile.
Yeah.
I can make that happen. See, we do this all that. We go out and try and make things happen and try to take care of ourselves. And it's like the parable Christ tells about the man who went out and filled all his barns with food. Then went and built bigger barns, filled those with food. And then he sat down and said, well, now I've got this food supply to go on forever. I'm set for life. And God comes to him and says, you fool, you're going to die tonight. Why did you waste your time? Doing all that. So we face the same dilemma. With us, it's less with the ritual magic. And with us, it's more, trusting in our own reasoning to make sound investments and, to work things out and have friends in the right places. But the same dilemma is there. It's trusting God to do what He said He'll do versus trying to make it happen ourselves.
We haven't learned a thing.
And so they think if we just get the right king, we get a guy who's a good leader and strong and a good strategist, military strategist, we can take care of these Philistines. Right? As opposed to God saying, even though they've got 3 times as many men as you do and they've got chariots and you don't, I'll make sure you win. Right? As much as we might laugh at them, that's a hard bet to take. That's, to exercise that kind of faith and that kind of trust.
Father Stephen, what I'm seeing to my brother Dave's question is very analytical of who we are. It's always the mission of the church, if you think about it. If you were to ask, bringing it forward today, to go down in Charleston, West Virginia and ask, where was Jesus born? Do you know Jesus? I'm sure many people would not know. Just as if we ask our citizens about our government, how it works. So looking at the analogy of David's question and you being a priest, it's an eternity type situation that the church must continuously tell the same story that's 2,000 years old, must continuously educate and re-educate its populace.
Right.
We may be living vessels. So I think it's very humanistic as human beings go. It's not the fact, we've got the book here, we know the historical facts. Hey, that's interesting. But we are also influenced, not only by where we live, but by also events of the world. Charleston is influenced by every other county in the state, by every other state, every other nation that affects us, a cause and effect. And the church has to be eternal in its continuous teaching. And I think that's one of the reasons why coming here tonight is so important, to regenerate who we are in society. So I don't know if that answers it, but that was just the analogy, because I would think the same way.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the element we saw in Deuteronomy where they were told again and again, teach your children, teach your children's children, that this has to continue. And we saw throughout the period of Judges that there was this breakdown where the next generation wasn't hearing. And we're going to see later tonight, Samuel's going to go back and tell the same story that Moses told them about how they were brought out of Egypt and how they were... So he's going to sort of try to re-educate them again. So yeah, there is this lack of knowledge. Okay. So they asked for this king, and God basically said, okay, you want a king, I'll give you a king. Right? You want one like the other nations, I'll give you one like the other nations. He says, here's what he's going to do. He says, first of all, he's going to tax you and take most of your wealth. He's going to take all of your best pieces of land for himself. He's going to take your sons and draft them into the military, and they're going to die in the wars that he's going to start. He's going to take your daughters and make them his concubines in his harem. He's going to take others of your sons and daughters and make them his slaves. Right? This is all going to go on, and God says, eventually, you're going to come to me the way you've been crying out about the Philistines, and you're going to cry out to me about this king. You're going to cry about your own king, who you asked for, who I'm going to put over you. But even though that was all laid out to them, they said, we still want a king. We still want a king. So God said, okay, I'll give it to you. Okay. So we saw how there was this man, Saul, who's from the tribe of Benjamin, which we already saw in Judges is not the best tribe to be from. Saul was, we're told, a head taller than all the other Israelites. So he's a big guy, he's a handsome guy, right? Good personality, projects strength. And so God told Samuel, there's the guy, make him king. So Samuel anointed him as king. He's now the king of Israel. But then when the time came in chapter 10 for the king to be sort of unveiled in front of all the Israelites, he went and hid in the luggage. He got some stage fright. And when they finally brought him out and said, "This is the king of Israel," we saw that already, even from that moment, there are a few people who are going, not, maybe this king thing was a bad idea, but I don't know about this Saul character. We could probably do better. Okay. That's pretty much where we left off at the end of chapter 10. So now chapter 11, verse 1. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. Remember, that's where Saul's from. And all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." Okay. So, the Ammonite king comes, he besieges the city. Does the city call out to God for help?
No.
No. Does it call out to his fellow Israelites for help? Let's make a treaty. We'll become one of your vassals. Right? Meaning, they're willing to just go and become an Ammonite town. Okay? This is the hometown of the new king. So we can see, at the very least, there's some ignorance going on here. They're not even loyal to Israel at all. But Nahash the Ammonite replied, "I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you and so bring disgrace on all Israel." So Nahash says, "Okay, we'll make a treaty, but only if I get to humiliate you. And humiliate you in a way that the rest of the Israelites will see, so that they'll know not to mess with Nahash the Ammonite." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you." So now they're a little desperate. They say, "Well, let us send out some messengers. Maybe somebody will come and help us. But if nobody does, I guess you can gouge out our eyes." Okay. When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he asked, "What is wrong with the people? Why are they weeping?" Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came upon him in power, and he burned with anger. Who does that remind you of? Samson, back in Judges. Remember, that was sort of the litany where it was rather than the Holy Spirit, some words of wisdom, some teaching, some instruction, sort of comes out in pure rage and destruction. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messenger throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." What does that remind you of? The woman who was by the Levite, right? So he's a Benjamite. He's falling back on this old tradition to summon them to war. But rather than saying, "We need to defend our brother's city, Yahweh will grant us victory," it's anybody who doesn't show up, I'm going to wreck your... So already the new king is sort of living up to the warnings. The warnings God gave them about him, about what a king would be like. So he sends out that message. And then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they turned out as one man. So they all show up. Message received. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000 and the men of Judah 30,000. They told the messengers who had come, "Say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow you will be delivered." When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated, as you might imagine. They said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever seems good to you." Okay, so they get the word. There's this 300,000 army coming to defend you. So they say to Nahash the Ammonite, "Oh yeah, we'll surrender tomorrow." So the next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. So the last watch of the night would be the last 3 hours before sunrise. Yeah, so you're probably dealing between 2:30 and 5:30 in the morning, say, and the heat of the day is like noon. So this is a good 9 or 10 hour massacre in the Ammonite camp. Those who survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. The people then said to Samuel, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us? Bring these men to us and we will put them to death.'" So they say, who were the people who were the naysayers? Who was talking trash on Saul, our new king? Look what he just did. Let's haul him out here and execute him. But Saul said, "No one shall be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and there reaffirm the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal and confirmed Saul as king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. Remember, the fellowship offerings were the offerings that you offered to settle disputes between people. So the idea is that they're now all coming together as one people behind their new king, Saul, in theory, at least. Right now, while they're happy. So chapter 12, verse 1, Samuel said to all Israel, "I have listened to everything you said to me, and have set a king over you. Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I am old and gray, and my sons are here with you. I have been your leader from my youth until this day. Here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me shut my eyes? If I have done any of these, I will make it right." Okay. So Samuel now, they've got their king, and so he's sort of stepping down. He's taking his leave as sort of the leader, and so he says, "If there's anybody here who can make any accusations against me, if there's anybody who I've done anything wrong, anything you can accuse me of, anybody I've cheated, anybody I've done, tell me right now, and I'll settle it." Verse 4, "You have not cheated or oppressed us," they replied. "You have not taken anything from anyone's hand." Samuel said to them, "The Lord is witness against you, and also his anointed is witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand." He is witness, they said. Okay. So they agreed. "No, you did. You did a good job. Never cheated anyone. You were a good ruler." Okay. So now that that's settled, now he's going to give them his parting sermon here. Then Samuel said to the people, "It is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your forefathers up out of Egypt. Now then stand here, because I am going to confront you with evidence before the Lord, as to all the righteous acts performed by the Lord for you and your fathers." Okay, so first he said, "Do you have anything to accuse me of?" They all agreed, "No, you haven't done anything." He said, "Okay, now I've got a couple of things that I want to bring up about you guys." Okay. But notice what the accusations are. He doesn't say, "I'm going to accuse you of some sins you people have been committing." He says, "I'm going to accuse you with what the Lord has done for you."
Yeah.
I'm going to recite to you what the Lord has done for you, and when I'm done, we'll see how you think your actions have measured up to what he's done for you. Verse 8, "After Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord for help, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your forefathers out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, so he sold them into the hand of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hatzor, and into the hands of the Philistines and the king of Moab, who fought against them. They cried out to the Lord and said, 'We have sinned, we have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. But now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you.' Then the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, and Samson, and he delivered you from the hands of your enemies on every side so that you lived securely. But when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, "No, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king. Now here is the king you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your fathers." So he says, look, this whole king thing, again, was a bad idea. Okay, but it's not a deal breaker. Right? It's not, God's not going to abandon you just because you... As for this king, as long as you and your king now follow the ways of the Lord, follow what he's set forth, good. Things will be well with you. God will bless you. But the same rules apply. If you and your king now go down the other road, the curses are still going to apply, and the same thing's going to happen to you that happened to your fathers during the period of the judges and in the wilderness and before. Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? I will call upon the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. Then Samuel called upon the Lord, and that same day the Lord sent thunder and rain. So all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. So he gives him a sign. He says, just so you know, I'm not just talking. It's not just my hurt ego that you picked this king over me. Right? He says, look at what season it is. It's sunny outside, everything's nice. I'm about to pray that there will be a thunderstorm. And we read he prayed and there was a thunderstorm the same day. Okay, so the people now know, okay, he was telling us the truth. And so in verse 19, the people all said to Samuel, "Pray to the Lord your God for your servants so that we will not die. For we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king." "Do not be afraid," Samuel replied. "You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. And if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will be swept away." Okay. So the people realize, okay, yeah, we blew it. Not only did we do all these other things, but now we asked for a king. And that was dead wrong. But you notice Samuel's response isn't, "Yep, you blew it. I'm getting out of town before before the hellfire of brimstone starts falling on your cities." No, he says, okay, from right now, right? Love and fear the Lord your God. I'll teach you, he says, I'll teach you the way. I mean, he's going to go back to Deuteronomy, go back to Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers that we read. I'm going to teach you. And if you do it from now, you do it now, you'll be blessed. Okay? So when you hear, this sort of goes against what we hear all the time with, Old Testament, angry, mean God, who throws thunderbolts at everybody. New Testament, nice, loving, forgiving God. Right? What Samuel just said is, all this evil I've just pointed out that you did, God will just overlook it. God will forgive you if right now you turn around and go in the other direction.
Like the prodigal son.
Like the prodigal son. Okay, so that this isn't something new that shows up in the New Testament with Christianity. God was dealing with people this way in the Iron Age. If you just turn from what you're doing now and go in the right direction, you'll honor that and bless that. So chapter 13, verse 1, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. And we're going to find out a little further on that this Jonathan fellow is his son. His son. And his name, Yonatan, literally means the gift of Yahweh. Okay, so Jonathan is his firstborn son. And we're going to see he's going to be acting, well, this is the first time it's discussed, he's going to be acting as sort of his military commander. Okay. And so out of this, we had this 300,000 man army. And so Saul sort of takes the 3,000, the cream of the crop, the top 1% of fighters out of this army. He sends the rest of them home. He divides them up. 2,000 he has at Michmash in the hill country of Bethel, garrison there. The other 1,000 are with his son at Gibeah and Benjamin. Verse 3, Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost. And now Israel has become a stench to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Remember what one of those warnings from God was about how if you have a king, he's going to start wars. Right? This is the first one of these wars we've seen that Israel really starts. The other times we've seen some other nation comes and attacks Israel, and God delivers them. This one, it's Saul's son who goes and launches this surprise attack against a Philistine city. And then Saul calls out to everyone, "It's on, we're at war with the Philistines." Okay? So this is the first sort of war of aggression here. So already we can see that Samuel's prophecy about how kings behave is coming true.
Did you say that Saul was 30 years old at this point?
He's 30 years old when he becomes king, yeah.
How soon after that is this battle with the Philistines? Because his son Jonathan is fighting. If he's 30, how old could Jonathan be leading an army?
You have to remember, people at this time are getting married at the age of 13.
They're leading armies?
Well, about 17.
The biggest issue with choosing a military commander at this time, he was asking about Jonathan's age. Okay. The biggest issue with appointing military, and it may be, there may be a 1 or 2 year time lapse here, but not a huge time lapse. The big issue with choosing military commanders at this time isn't so much that they're battle hardened and experienced as that they're loyal. Because if there's going to be a coup, right, if someone else is going to assassinate you and take over as king, the most likely place that's going to come from is somewhere in your military structure. Right, that they're going to get some of the men to follow them and come in and assassinate you. So even though at this point Jonathan is probably literally a teenager and young and inexperienced, relatively inexperienced, since he's his firstborn son, he's someone who Saul feels confident is going to carry out his orders. Right? And isn't likely, at least at that age. Now we're going to see sometimes these political assassinations are going to happen later on as the sons grow up. They start getting dangerous.
But you have to realize at that time too, a person in their 40s was considered to be old.
Right.
A person in their 50s and 60s was considered ancient.
Yeah, Saul living to be 72 here
he would be considered a very, very, very old person.
That's ancient. But again, the reason they got married at 13, you were considered an adult at 13
Yeah.
in this culture. There was no concept of adolescence like we have it
He was
today.
a child, then he was a man.
It hasn't changed. Bar mitzvahs at 12.
Yeah, they still have bar mitzvahs at that age. Now you usually don't get married at that age anymore, even Jewish communities. There are parts of the world where people still get married in. But in this world, basically, essentially, sexual maturity was maturity. When you were at the age where you could have children, you were married off and expected to begin having children.
And of course, adolescent impulsiveness might explain why you attacked the Philistines.
Yeah.
That's possible. But so yeah, and there's a high infant mortality rate. So the idea was you had to get started early and try to have as many children as possible in the hopes that a few would survive to adulthood. So it's a different.
I just had a hard time imagining a teenager leading an army of men into battle.
Well,
when you figure about half of them's his age.
well, that was one of the surprising things to me when I saw, for example, Saving Private Ryan. You find out what the average age of a soldier was in World War II or World War I or the Civil War. Most of them were teenagers. They're 17, 18, 19 years old. You know?
They told in the North, half the generals was under 30 at one time in the Civil War. So you don't see a general in the Army that's under 30 now.
So it's different now.
We live longer.
But at that time, and I mean, life was a lot shorter. It was a lot dirtier and more violent and more brutal. And we're going to see some of that. Some of that coming up here. Is there? Here's something.
Where does it say
How old who was? We were just doing math on Jonathan. Because Kevin's question was Saul's 30 when he becomes king. So how old could his son be at the time he becomes king? And so, assuming Saul got married around 13, Jonathan's his firstborn son, he's probably a teenager. Yeah, we're estimating based on Saul's age. So in verse 5, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. When the men of Israel saw that their situation was critical, to say the least, the Philistines, not only have they assembled this huge army, but you see they went and camped right next to their army garrison. Right? So, not only do they have this huge army, that huge army just comes and sets up camp right next to where Israel's army is camped. Right? As if to say, come on out. Right? So the people of Israel see, wow, this is not a good situation. And so they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Okay? So, the general outlook, we just saw Saul had that first victory and everybody was behind him and all right Saul. Right? Now he starts this war with the Philistines and everybody's kind of like, looking for hiding places, getting out of town. Right? They're not quite as confident in Saul anymore.
Maybe because he launched a war of aggression and was better.
So in verse 7, still Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. So he doesn't run at least, but his troops are scared. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. Now this is a critical event that happens here. Okay. What was supposed to happen was Samuel. Remember, Eli and his family were wiped out. They were serving as the high priest was Eli. His sons were killed. Okay, Samuel had been raised by Eli. And we've seen that Samuel has basically taken over the high priestly functions. Right? That he's been offering the sacrifices. Okay? Now, what are they supposed to be doing? There's this crisis where people don't know if Saul is going to be able to lead them to victory. Well, the whole point is Saul isn't supposed to be leading them to victory, right? Yahweh is supposed to be leading them to victory. God is supposed to be leading them to victory. Okay? And so the idea is that Samuel is going to come and offer the sacrifices to God and pray to God to give them victory, that God would lead them into this battle. Okay? And so he says, I'll arrive at Gilgal, where you are, in 7 days. Okay? Well, we've got the enemy army camped here. We've got people deserting in all directions, hiding in caves, hiding in wells. Okay? Saul's looking around at his own troops. He sees some of his own troops starting to desert. Right? And he decides, well, I can't wait anymore. Okay? I can't wait anymore. I'm just going to do this myself. So he has them bring the animals that Samuel is going to sacrifice to him, and he does the sacrifices himself. Okay? He does the rituals himself. Now, we can start
couldn't do that.
We can start a short list of the problems with this. Number one, he's not supposed to be making sacrifices, right? He's not a priest. He's not a Levite. No connection whatsoever to that. Okay? He's the king. Number two, the whole purpose of this sacrifice is that instead of trusting in Saul, they're going to trust in Yahweh. Okay? The third thing is this sacrifice was to be public, right? The people were all supposed to be praying for this victory. Saul goes and does it like it's just a formality we have to get out of the way.
Goes in the tent
before we go out to fight. Right? Oh, we got to get this sacrifice thing taken care of so we can get out there and start fighting. Where's Samuel? Where is he? What? Oh, I'll just do it. Okay. Is that how the worship of God is supposed to take place? I'm in a hurry to get into this battle, so I'll just do it real quick. Okay? So all these problems, and to make everything worse, as soon as he finishes doing it, Samuel shows up. Samuel shows up.
Sheep's at.
Yeah, with oops. Okay.
Oops.
So verse 11, what have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, when I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. Right? So he says, well, I thought they were about to attack, and we hadn't sacrificed to God yet. So I said, oh, I'll take care of it. Okay? Verse 13, you acted foolishly, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. Okay? So he says, remember the speech I gave not that long ago when I said to the Israelites, if you and your king, it's going to all be good with you. Here he extends it even further. He said, if you had done what you were supposed to do, your kingdom, meaning your descendants, would have ruled over Israel for all time, for eternity. But you didn't do it. You didn't do it. And so he says in verse 14, but now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. So he doesn't say, you're going to die. At least not right now. He doesn't say, your son's going to die. It's actually worse than that. He says, the Lord found someone else. Yahweh found somebody else who he's going to make king. And that person is a man after his own heart. Meaning, that person's on the same page as him. That person's going to follow through on what you failed to follow through on. And he says that it's already happened. He tells Saul, this has already happened. So you're technically still king.
But not for long.
But not for long. Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. Okay? Remember, he had 2,000 there. He's down to 600. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Geba of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the vicinity of Shual, another toward Beth Horon, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim facing the desert. They've got this huge army, right? Hundreds of thousands of people. They need to feed it, right? They need to supply it. Well, how do they do that? They send out troops in all the surrounding villages to steal food, to steal provisions, to steal whatever they need, and bring it back into their camp. So now it's not just that the Philistines are camped there for war. The Philistines are developing a garrison smack in the middle of Israel. Verse 19, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. Well, why were the blacksmiths not to be found? Because the Philistines killed them. Okay, so the Philistines find anybody who's a blacksmith by trade who can make weapons and kill them in all these towns. To keep, because they know they've whittled down Saul's army a lot. Right? Now he can't resupply. Now he can't call out more men because they won't have any weapons. Verse 20, so all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. Price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes, and for repointing goads. So not only can they not make weapons, but they're farming implements. Right? If they need to get their axe sharpened, they don't have any blacksmiths. They have to go and pay the Philistines in these garrisons to do that for them. So the Philistines are now occupied. I mean, we heard several times about the Philistines oppressing Israel in Judges. It's now at a new level because of what Saul started through his son. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Now a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. Chapter 14, verse 1. One day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side. But he did not tell his father. So this person who carries his armor, it was fairly common at that time that if you were any kind of, that your average enlisted person didn't really have armor. Right? They'd have some leather clothing maybe, but that was about it. Okay, but your higher ranking officials would have some kind of metal armor with metal plates. Okay? And this metal armor, these metal weapons obviously are heavy. So your average day, they're not walking around wearing all their armor and carrying all their weapons while they're walking around in town or inspecting the troops or any of this. So they have a servant, basically a slave, who follows them, who keeps track of their armor and weapons. And if the time comes, helps them get the armor on, gives them whatever weapon they ask for. Okay? So that's who this young man bearing his armor is, who's with Jonathan when he crosses over to the Philistine outpost. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod, meaning he's serving as a priest. Right? He was a son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. Remember, Ichabod was the son of Eli's son, who was born just as Eli and his father and his son Phinehas died. So this is the son of Ichabod, here, who's now serving as a priest with Saul. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Seneh. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south toward Geba. So to get there, he's got to go through this pass between two cliffs, which is not very good strategic ground, because you would expect that they would have guards, troops up on the cliffs, archers, who would have the high ground and have the advantage. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised fellows." That's kind of a nice... What does yours have? Uncircumcised fellows? Is that the... It's actually closer to uncircumcised dogs. They're uncircumcised beasts. "Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." He said. So he's basically saying, maybe the Lord will favor us. We'll pick off a few Philistines. If Yahweh's on our side, even though there's just a couple of us, we should be okay. "Do all that you have in mind," his armor bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come then, we will cross over toward the men and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So he's saying, if they see us coming, right, and say, "Wait right there, stop," and they come and approach us, we'll know we're in trouble. But if they say, "Hey, climb up the cliff, come here, climb up the cliff," then we'll know, because that would not be the normal thing. Right? If you've got somebody on guard duty and they see somebody coming, normally they're going to tell them to stop and come and inspect and find out who they are. But if for whatever reason they tell us to come up and see them, then we'll know, because that's odd. We'll know that means that God is helping us out here, and we'll make our move. Verse 11, "So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. 'Look,' said the Philistines, 'the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in.' The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, 'Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson.'" Okay? So they tell him to come on up, but not in a real polite way. It's more like, "Why don't you come over here and we'll, show you something." So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Okay, now let's stop for a second. We've said a lot about the type of person Saul is. We've seen the type of person he is. We heard about Jonathan launching that first attack, but now, in addition to his name, gift of Yahweh, what type of person does he seem to be?
Not very smart.
Well, not very smart. But remember the contrast I was making in answer to your question before, right?
He's like David.
Well, but we were talking about there's the two things. There's God saying, "Look, I don't care what the numbers say, and I don't care what it looks like. If you trust in me and do what you're supposed to be doing, I'll give you the victory." And there's, "I can do it myself. We'll get superior numbers and tactics, and we'll do this." Okay, we see that Saul's sort of over here. Jonathan right now, it's him, him and his servant, two people, walking up to a Philistine garrison, right, full of chariots, and he says to his servant, "Oh, see? God's given them to us." as he's walking towards the garrison. Okay? So, of people we've seen already, Jonathan reminds me at least a lot of Caleb. Remember Caleb back when he was an old man in his 70s in Joshua? When he said, "Well, I'm old now, but I'm going to pick the toughest city with the highest walls. And that's going to be my city." And he went and conquered it. Jonathan has some of the same, right? He's like, "Hey, if God's on my side, the two of us can take out this whole garrison," right? So verse 13, Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Okay? So with this striking them down and killing them, we talked before about how the weapons they're using at this time, and Jonathan was one of the few people who still had a weapon, as we read, with the blacksmith's gone. Didn't hold an edge real well. Okay, so it was less slicing with swords and more sort of beating people to death with a big piece of metal. So what's happening is Jonathan is knocking these people down and taking them down, and his armor bearer is following him probably with a spear and stabbing them on the ground and finishing them off. Okay, so just in this initial jump, the two of them kill 20 Philistines. Okay, and clear out an area of about half an acre. Verse 15, then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. So word gets out that somebody's slaughtering one edge of the camp, and then there's an earthquake to boot. Okay, there's an earthquake to boot. So the Philistine garrison is now completely panicked. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah of Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, muster the forces and see who has left us. When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who were not there. Right? So he says, what's going on? Do we have troops over there? They gather everybody together. The only people gone are Jonathan and his armor-bearer. Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God. At that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. So first he says, he's still sort of hedging his bets here. Not real confident. Just, bring God with us again. Trying the idol trick, which worked so well earlier in Samuel. But then he sees this whole garrison is just being wrecked of its own accord. So he says, don't bother. Right? He says, don't worry about it. Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. So they're so panicked, they're swinging at each other. Okay, they're killing each other. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. I like that. But this is why I said, oh, they're on the run? I'm in now. Right now they come swarming out of their holes and they're hiding there. Yeah, I'll join in on the big victory. So the Lord rescued Israel that day, and the battle moved on beyond Bethaven. Now the men of Israel were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. Where does Saul's virtually quoting someone there from the book of Judges? Remember Samson after he had his eyes put out? His last quote-unquote prayer to God was, give me my strength back just this one more time so I can have vengeance on my enemies. Right? Notice the difference between the way Saul talks and the way his son talks. With Saul, it's all about, none of you are going to eat until all these Philistines are dead. Because they crossed me, Saul. Right? The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath, so he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth and his eyes brightened, or his strength was restored. Then one of the soldiers told him, your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, cursed be any man who eats food today. That is why the men are faint. Jonathan said, my father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? So, remember that loyalty thing?
We was talking back there.
He's not disloyal, but Jonathan, we now know, is aware of the type of man his father is. Not only is he a different type of man, but he's aware. He's aware. That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Yeah. Then someone said to Saul, "Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it." Okay. See, that's as Jonathan pointed out. He starts this war. Saul starts this war. Saul then says nobody's allowed to eat. Right? And you notice the people obeyed Saul. They didn't eat until the battle was over. But now, who are they disobeying?
God.
So this wasn't just a one-time thing where they picked Saul to be their king instead of God. This is an ongoing thing where they're listening to him instead of God. So someone says to Saul, "Look, they're sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You have broken faith," he said. "Roll a large stone over here at once." And then he said, "Go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it." So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. So lest you think, it starts to sound like, oh, well, maybe Saul's trying to correct them and get them on the right path. What was the big problem just before this battle? He offered sacrifices, right? Samuel said, "This is a horrible thing you did. Because of this, your king, is going to fall." Did that click with him?
Here he's doing it again.
Now he's building an altar. Now he's building an altar and offering sacrifices. Verse 36, Saul said, "Let's go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn. Let us not leave one of them alive." "Do whatever seems best to you," they replied. But the priest said, "Let us inquire of God here." Crazy suggestion out of left field. Hey, maybe we should ask God what we should do. Notice that's the first time in all this, other than Jonathan, that's happened.
It said something.
That anybody's even suggested, hey, what do you think God wants us to do? So Saul asked God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer him that day.
Hello.
Saul therefore said, "Come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if it lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." But not one of the men said a word. Okay, so he says, "God, should we go kill all the rest of the Philistines? Are we going to win if we do it?" No answer. So he says, "Oh, somebody did something wrong. That's why God's not giving me an answer." He said, "When I find out who it is, I'm going to kill him, even if it's my own firstborn son." So verse 40, Saul then said to all the Israelites, "You stand over there. I and Jonathan my son will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," the men replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Give me the right answer." And Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, "Cast the lot between me and Jonathan my son," and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." So Jonathan told him, "I merely tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now must I die?" Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." So Saul, to remind you of someone else from the book of Judges, remember, Jephthah took the oath, first one who runs out to meet me, I'll sacrifice, right? And it turns out to be his daughter. Well, now here's Saul. "I don't care who it is, even if it's Jonathan, I'll kill him." Oops. And now it seems like, just like Jephthah, he's ready to follow through on it. Verse 45, but the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel?" Right? They say, it was kind of Jonathan who touched off this whole victory thing we have going now. You know, is he the guy who we want to kill? Never, as surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. Okay, so the people have to rebel en masse in order to save Jonathan from his own father. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered him. Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his older daughter was Merab, and that of the younger was Michal. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. Okay, so Abner is therefore his cousin. Abner, now this is an exercise in creative naming. His uncle is named Ner. His son is named Abner, which means my father is Ner. Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were sons of Abiel. All the days of Saul there was...
Were there any Abner?
No. All the days of Saul there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. So there was the draft. We'll go on a little bit more here. Chapter 15, Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel, so listen now to the message from the Lord. Right, so he shows up and he sort of pulls rank. I'm the one who put you in this position. So I'll listen to what I'm about to say. This is what the Lord Almighty says: I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So see, we've talked about how there were these two sorts of situations. There were these two types of war. Right? There were times where God's judgment was against a people, and he sent Israel to do the judging when he said, my judgment is they're wiped out. Okay? Where he's using them as the weapon, like the fire from heaven that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And then he gave rules in Deuteronomy for other type of wars that break out, where they had to try to attempt to find a peaceful resolution. You know, they weren't allowed to take women as slaves, etc., etc. Okay. So this is one of those situations where God says, okay, the Amalekites, their sin has reached the point where I have to deal with them. Go and wipe them out. Verse 4, so Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you all along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur to the east of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. Right?
Going down the road again.
So he gets told by God, my judgment is against them, go in and wipe out everything. So he goes and captures their king, and he says, you got a lot of nice stuff around here in Amalek. I think I'm going to make some of your nice stuff my nice stuff, right? So instead of wiping it out the way he's supposed to, he takes it. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Okay, so they go through the flocks, you know, the sheep that aren't looking so good, the ones that look sick, the ones with the broken legs, those they kill. Right? All the healthy ones and everything, those they keep. Right, so what are they offering to God? They're offering to God everything they don't want. And taking everything they want. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was troubled, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Now this is interesting here. Because remember, God picked Saul to sort of give the Israelites what they wanted.
But he already knew what was going to happen.
Well, he knew what was going to happen, but he's saying, not only should Israel, but Saul is going above and beyond in fulfilling that role of teaching Israel a lesson in what kings do. Notice also, that first time he offers the sacrifice, and Samuel basically shows up and says it's over. Okay, but it's not as if Saul lived his whole life and was this great king, and then one day he made this one mistake and that ruined everything. Right? This is a pattern. Right? This is a pattern. This is over and over and over again. It's about him and not about God. Right? It's about him and his orders, his vengeance, his enemies, his territory. Okay. The other interesting thing is Samuel's reaction. Right? You don't see Samuel come to the people of Israel and say, I told you so, God's mad now. Right? You did it again. Right? No. Samuel is weeping day and night over what Saul's doing. Okay? Because Samuel didn't want to show up and say, I told you so. Right? Samuel wanted Saul to be different. He wanted the people to follow God finally.
Staying up all night, is that an image of Gethsemane?
Probably in part. But that should speak to us too. Because I know at least me, I'm much more prone to the I told you so. See? than I am to the being up all night crying and praying for the person who's fallen into whatever trouble I told them they were going to get into. Right? I'm much more with the I told you, see, you should listen to me. So verse 12, early in the morning Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. Right? So remember, before they were setting up stones and setting up monuments to remember the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Saul just went and set one up for the great things that Saul has done for Israel. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, the Lord bless you, I have carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep I hear in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? So he shows up and Saul's real religious, right? Yahweh bless you, I have done all that Yahweh told me to do. And Samuel's like, I hear some sheep and some cows. Where'd they come from? Saul answered, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. So thinking quickly, he says, oh yeah, we were just going to sacrifice those. Stop, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. So he cuts him off. Right? He says, stop. Let me tell you what the Lord told me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? Remember when Samuel first came and anointed him, Saul was saying, how could I be king? I'm from Benjamin. We're this wee little tribe, and I'm from a poor family. How could I be king? Samuel's reminding him, remember? You didn't think you were all that important then. But God made you king over all of Israel. The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Make war on them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Verse 22, but Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much in obeying the voice of the Lord? Right? You're going to have these big sacrifices. Okay, which do you think God wants more? You to have the big fancy rituals and the sacrifices and the festival? Or for you to obey Him and do what He says? Okay. This is going to become a theme through the rest of the Old Testament. It's going to get worse. It's going to get to the point in the Minor Prophets where God's going to tell them in the temple, stop having the sacrifices. He's going to say your sacrifices are obscene. I don't want to see them. Okay? Because he's going to say, none of you people actually worship me. He's going to say, none of you people actually have fear of me in your heart. You're just doing rituals. So stop it. Don't bother. Okay? That's the question here. And this is a question we have to ask ourselves too. Okay? Especially us as Orthodox Christians, because we have real fancy church, right? We have ritual, we've got pretty vestments, colors, motions, incense swinging around, you know. It's beautiful. And we've got an incredible choir here too. It's beautiful. Okay? But if we're not following God and obeying God in our lives, might as well stay home. Might as well stay home.
It's an empty shed.
Might as well not bother having it. Okay. It's not that these rituals are bad or the sacrifices then were bad or our church services is bad, but they have to be an expression. They have to be an expression of what's going on in our heart, what's going on in our lives. They have to be real. They have to be real.
So you're saying at that time, at this point in time, that they was doing all the sacrificing and all this, and the Lord just says, well, you don't really care, you're just trying to make me happy.
Well, that's the question. He says, which do you think makes God happy? These sacrifices, or you obeying Him?
And the answer should be obeying Him.
Right. And that's...
And the sacrifices are a way of controlling God.
Well, right. But so, if the sacrifices are an expression of your obedience and love for God, if our worship in church is an expression of our love for God and our obedience for God, then it's a beautiful thing.
Okay.
But if it's not, if we're far from God the rest of the week and we show up on Sunday, we might as well not show up on Sunday. Because we're still far from God, despite all the beauty and all the pageantry and all the everything else. And that's in the second part of verse 22. Samuel answers it. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, He has rejected you as king. So we say, you may not have gone out and worshiped Baal. Right? But his arrogance and his pride, his worshiping himself, is just as bad as if he had gone off and worshiped Baal. All this talk about Yahweh set aside. Right? What he's done is idolatry. What he's done is like witchcraft. And so he says, because you've rejected the word of the Lord, He has rejected you as king. Verse 24, then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. Okay. He starts out okay. Okay, I sinned. Okay, I didn't do what He told me to do. But it was the people. Right? They pressured me. I wanted to kill everything, but they made me take the sheep and the cattle. I was scared of them. Right? So he's still making excuses. Right? He's still making excuses. He says, so just forgive me and we'll go back and we'll worship the Lord together. We'll have sacrifices like the old days. Right? It'll be great. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the edge of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind." Okay, so again, he tells them, it's too late. There's already someone else who God's picked to take your place.
Now, this is the second time he's told
Second time he's been told
that. He's
that.
told him he's not going to make her.
Saul replied, "I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites." Agag came to him confidently, thinking, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." Right? So he goes back and he says, "Bring that king you captured." Remember the one you were supposed to kill? So Agag comes out, right? He's thinking, well, the fighting's over. I should be okay. I'm a prisoner. But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women." And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. So Samuel does go back with Saul in front of the people, but he makes a pretty graphic display in front of the people of what Saul was supposed to do that he didn't do, right? Which is carry out God's judgment on this king.
And Saul was supposed to kill him, and he did.
And he didn't. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. So again, Samuel never sees him again. The two of them never see each other. But Samuel spends the rest of his life mourning and grieving for Saul and what's happened to him. Again, not told you so, not should have done it, but grieving for what happened to this man, who could have been a great man.
And then this Rama here was mentioned, is this the same one where later in the future,
Rama weeping for her children.
Yeah.
Rama?
Yeah.
Is that the same?
That's the same area. And it's gonna come up again here later on.
Rachel.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's probably a good place to stop for this. If a sad place. Saul is probably one of the most tragic figures in the Old Testament. I mean, we've seen some people who were, like Samson, who were off base right from the start and just kind of carnal and wicked and that. But Saul is a person who we really get to see sort of what could have been and what wasn't because of the choices he made. The kind of person he started out as, and we're going to see his story isn't over yet. But there's more tragedy there to come with him and his son Jonathan. So unless there are questions.
Something that I guess is somewhat confusing to me, and as the Israelites first crossed Jordan into the Promised Land, and they had their mission, basically conquer all these things, take the land from that mission. Obviously, they didn't do that. Now they get to the point where they're going to the king's bank, and they're saying, well, these people are leaving, didn't that what he wanted to do to start with?
Oh, with the wars? Okay. Kevin's question was, originally, God's command to them when they came across the Jordan to the Promised Land was to wipe out all these peoples, right, and to take the land. And he's saying, well, now that they've got a king, right, isn't the king, by going and attacking these people, sort of fulfilling that? And I should have commented as we went past it. Remember, there's that list of the places Saul attacked.
Yeah.
Right? And some of them, like the Philistines, were on that list that were supposed to be wiped out. But we're told he also attacked, for example, Edom and Moab, which God explicitly told them not to attack yet. So it's not so much that some of those people weren't as Saul is attacking indiscriminately to enlarge his borders. And he's doing it not to, as we've seen here graphically, not to carry out God's judgment against these people, but to enlarge his borders, the large size of his kingdom and his control. And so it doesn't matter to him whether it's the Philistines or Edom and whether God is said to attack them or not.
He's going to go get it.
He's just pressing out in all directions. And so the Amalekites, the ones where he's explicitly told to go wipe them out by God, as we saw, he doesn't. So it's not so much that, God's will is still being accomplished, for example, with the Philistines. But as we saw with some of the judges, they freed Israel, but they didn't do it by being good, moral, upstanding believers themselves. What God wants to happen is getting accomplished in some of these cases. But it's sort of in spite of Saul, not because Saul is trying to do God's will. Any other questions? Okay, thanks everybody for coming on this cold, wintry night. We'll try to do chapters, I'll say 16 through 20 next time. Now, we're coming into Lent very quickly. So we're going to be having Lenten Vespers out of town every other week. So on those weeks, we won't be having Bible study. Okay? And on the weeks where we have Vespers in town, unless anybody objects, I was going to still have Bible study, even though it'll probably end up starting...
Maybe 15 minutes later.
I was going to say 15 minutes later. We'll probably end up starting the time we normally start. But yeah, it'll be more like 6:45 because we'll start after Vespers.
Vespers is 6.
Vespers is at 6 and it takes between half an hour and 45 minutes.
Close to half an hour.
And so we'll do Bible study on those weeks. And each of these nights I'll say, next week we're having class. Next week we're skipping. And then, of course, Holy Week and Easter we'll be not having.
So basically, we'll be starting class at the same time.